climate is changing, so make no mistake. And we should distinguish between climate variability and climate change. So every season has climate variability. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't. Temperature goes up and down. Those things happen. Climate change is, we're saying, is there a new baseline?
Welcome to the Leader's Edge podcast. I'm Sandy Laycox, coming to you live from the Council's 2025 Insurance Leadership Forum. We sat down with Rob Newbold, President of Extreme Event Solutions at Verisk, for a conversation about the forces driving change in global catastrophe loss, how modeling is responding, and how brokers, carriers, and other industry stakeholders can better utilize these tools to improve coverage and resilience. We start off with some key takeaways from Verisk's recently released report, Modeling Insured Catastrophe Losses, a Global Perspective for 2025.
We've put out this report every year since 2012. It's our report on global modeled insured catastrophe losses. And we've done this report for all this time for a few reasons. First, it was just to try to draw attention to the global protection gap. So there's a notable difference between insured catastrophe losses and economic losses, and we'll maybe come back to that later in our discussion today. Then it was to try to give some contextualization to the overall level of loss. So obviously losses are increasing every year, and we'll talk about that too, but to make $100 billion seem less unusual than maybe it seemed at the time. And then the third reason, which again we can talk about today if you want, is what's driving that increasing loss. So this year's report has the global modeled insured cat loss at $152 billion. That's an average loss, so that means in any given year, the market has to be capitalized to sustain potentially much more than that. And what's interesting about what makes up that 152 this year is it's not necessarily hurricanes or earthquakes. They're there, of course, but 65% of that 152 comes from what we call frequency perils. So severe thunderstorm, winter storm, wildfire, flood. You know, to get out into the tail, to get to the $400 or $500 billion, you still do need hurricanes or earthquakes, but the industry needs to be aware, and I think they are aware because they're suffering the losses, that there's a lot of other things that are driving that AAL up.
Absolutely. All right, let's dig into that a little bit more.
Let's do it.
So you all talk about four interconnected forces that are driving these changes. Can you talk about those with us?
Yeah, so perhaps not surprisingly, the biggest thing driving the loss increase over time is exposure growth. So if we look back to when we started doing this in 2012, the losses compound at roughly 7% each year. And about 5 of that 7% comes from exposure increases. Now that could be increase in property value. It could be inflation. It's people building their properties in high hazard areas. And people like to live on the water. They like to live a beautiful countryside here in Colorado. You like to live up next to the tree line. Those are hazardous areas. Rapid urbanization is sort of 1A, 1 and 2. So now more than 50% of the world's population lives in urban areas. And one of the fastest growing urban areas in the US is Dallas-Fort Worth, which is highly exposed to severe convective storm hail risk. So those two factors are driving risk up. There's some natural variability in catastrophe losses. We've added new perils to the risk analysis this year. So simply thinking about that natural seasonal variability and new perils coming in. And then the last one, which you're probably hoping I talk about at some point, is climate change. So the climate is absolutely changing. But again, if we go back to that 7% over time, we'd say in aggregate, only about 1% of that 7% can truly be attributed to a changing climate.
I then asked whether we would ever simply stop building in such risky places. Maybe a rhetorical question, but it did lead to a conversation about mitigation in those areas.
You can construct properties that are resistant to catastrophe activity. So let's say you're right on the coast, you can elevate your property. You've seen some of these properties in Florida and coastal Texas up on stilts. That keeps the water out. You can have straps on your roof. You can have hurricane shutters. You can have concrete siding rather than wood frame. There's a number of things you can do to mitigate the risk. For wildfire turns out to be, not surprisingly, more of a community mitigation rather than an individual home, because there's wind and the embers jump from trees to roofs, and if you're really close to your house and your neighbor's house is extremely flammable, that's not good for the overall neighborhood risk. Now your follow-up question is, well, that's really cool. Why doesn't everybody do that? It's not free, so adding these things to your house costs money, and you want to make sure that when you're putting that investment into your property, you're getting commensurate credit for it on the rates you're paying for your insurance. you'll hear me use this word a lot today. There's an ecosystem that really deals with catastrophe risk, from the local governments to state governments to insurance companies to reinsurers to brokers to modelers. And we all have to be talking and working together to understand how we can help to solve this problem.
We turn to modeling and a discussion of how the field has evolved to make use of new data and keep up with modern climate risk.
I mean, modeling has been around for almost more than 35 years now, I think. So there have been dramatic changes over time across a number of vectors. And let's spend a few minutes talking about them. On the way models are built, I think the initial version of models were more statistical. So you're looking at probability distributions for hurricanes of things like how many storms will you have in a year, where will they make landfall, what does your intensity distribution look like? But as the climate continues to change, data becomes more available and computing technology advances, we're now really using physics to model these risks rather than statistics. And that allows us to cover things like what's happening in the recent past and the near present future to give a physically based estimation of what catastrophe loss could look like. Now, that fundamental change of looking at physics allows us to get more granular, to have a better rooftop estimation of what risk may look like, which opens up a number of possibilities for how everyone in the value chain can take these models and get a better estimation of risk. Again, we'll probably talk in a few minutes about how the market can come together to help to use this technology to be more resilient to catastrophes. Now, I recognize that we sit in an interesting position in the value chain, that we are independent arbiters of risk. So our models evolve, and we're able to give our estimate of what we believe is a reasonable technical price for a given risk. But it's a marketplace, and there's a transaction to be had between broker and carrier and reinsurer, consumer and insurance company. And the technical price is just one piece of that. So again, we have to do as good a job as we can to describe how we're technically estimating each of those risks to allow that conversation to happen more fluid.
I asked Rob to delve further into how models are being adapted for changing climate conditions. And then we turned to the operational aspect of integrating these models into broker and carrier work.
Climate is changing, so make no mistake, and we should distinguish between climate variability and climate change. So every season has climate variability. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't. Temperature goes up and down. Those things happen. Climate change is, we're saying, is there a new baseline? Is there a new normal against which we should look? And I don't think you'll find anybody who would argue that that's not the case. There is a new baseline. And depending on which peril you look at, the impact that new baseline has is going to be different. So, we have 50 plus models for 100 countries around the world. And we wouldn't be doing the market justice if we just waved a magic wand and said, well, they're all now climate ready. Go ahead and do your thing. So as we introduce a new model or update a current model, we're being very diligent to look at what we would call near present view of climate risk, which means this model off the shelf should be good for you to confidently estimate your risk for the next 5 to 7 years. And that's a pretty good baseline. That means we're looking at recent history and using physics and simulation to look at near present future to give you a confident view of risk over that time horizon. That's usually pretty good for the insurance market, and they're often annual contracts, sometimes reinsurance or multi-year contracts. We understand the notion of lifetime customer value, and we can certainly continue to iterate to bring models to market to help to facilitate that conversation. We do have views of risk for much longer term climate. So for a hurricane, for example, we can provide views of risk for 2030, 2050, 2070, and 2100. How useful is that for underwriting your book of business today? There's some regulatory concerns where that's maybe a good piece of information. Or if you're thinking about, do I want to go to a new market? Is it going to be underwater in 2050?
Right.
Maybe you can use science to help to answer that question. There's a lot of moving parts. Maybe one last thing I'll throw in to answer your question. The impetus on us to provide more updates to models more frequently. So severe thunderstorm is a good example. We brought that model to market in 2022. And we need to be honest with ourselves and our client base that we didn't get it right. So we talked to the market, we saw the loss activity, we put that model back into research, and just this year we brought out a new model that has significant updates based on actual loss activity, based on climatology, and allowing us to confidently go to carriers of all shapes and sizes and say, this is a better mousetrap for you to think about this risk. We did that for wildfire in 2024, we're doing that for hurricane in 2026, and we'll continue our march around the world to try to help answer this question.
Yeah. Okay, you touched on this a little bit, but we're going to go back to it.
How does this translate operationally for both brokers and carriers as everyone is trying to integrate the technology into their systems and be able to use it as best they can?
Yeah, I mean, this is where technology is an enabler. So we are at our core, Extreme Event Solutions at Verisk, we are a modeling company, but we are not so naive to ignore the fact that our models are delivered through technology, and the way they're used and deployed is different for all those different parts of the value chain you just laid out. The original versions of models some 30 years ago were aggregate, portfolio-based tools designed to run very quickly on very little data. But in 2025, with advances in technology, scalable architectures, cloud-based computing, and more physical-based modeling, we're giving views of risk that can, again, run at the rooftop in seconds. So imagine an agent who wants to quote a given risk for an insurance company. We have APIs and technology that can put this directly into your workflow. So in seconds, you can get a loss estimate based on our model for that particular property. Once that risk is bound, it then gets into an overall portfolio for whichever carrier picks that up. Once it gets translated into reinsurance, that same portfolio then goes to the reinsurance market. And it's a consistent view of risk currency that we're facilitating for every part of that value chain, from individual risk to portfolio assessment, data passed up and down the value chain with technology behind it all to make it run either in seconds if necessary or as quickly as it can if you're looking at 10 million risks across a portfolio.
So what are the challenges that you're finding brokers and or carriers are having in integrating? Because it sounds
great.
fantastic.
Right? Yeah, let's do it immediately. Why doesn't
Surely,
everybody have this?
right, exactly. So what are you seeing as the biggest hurdles?
It's a complicated market. So if I selfishly put on my hat as a cat modeler, I think there will always be debate around the actual loss estimates coming out of the model, the difference between reality and what the model says. Because if you take a step way back and you think about why modeling was created in the first place, the purpose of a catastrophe model is to generate a view of risk for something that may not have happened yet. So we are by definition trying to not predict the future, but give a loss distribution that lets you see what could happen should the worst thing possible happen to your book of business. So there is a lot of diligence, rightly, that goes into everybody in that value chain to making sure the model we give them is reasonable for the risk that they're writing. And that in and of itself is frictional because we have 50 models, 100 countries. There's a lot of time spent in helping to understand, is this the right view of risk? Our job is to partner with as many of those people as we can to give them tools to show why we think it's right. We need to be able to build tools into our workflow to allow different stakeholders to make adjustments. Maybe broker A believes this view of risk is too high, so they can adjust the frequency, or a particular carrier thinks they have a better underwriting procedure, so they will adjust the severity of the claim. Those so-called dials and knobs need to be built into the technology to let that happen. And the more you do that, the more complex that workflow becomes. It's a really interesting evolution of how technology has enabled flexibility in modeling that by definition makes it more complex and slows down maybe how it's used across the value chain.
Yeah.
Finally, we talk about partnerships and opportunities to share models and views of risk and ultimately what success looks like.
Where do you think the best opportunities are for partnerships in this to really build this resilience?
Yeah, there's a lot actually. So again, I'll start selfishly and then move maybe to broader market partnerships. We have a platform called Model Exchange. It is a catastrophe modeling ecosystem that provides access from non-Verisk models provided by 15 model providers and more than 300 views of risk around the world. These are partnerships that allow anybody in the value chain to either supplement a view of risk they're getting from Verisk or fill a gap for where we don't have a model. So we have a model roadmap. There will be parts of the world that it just doesn't make sense or we don't have the infrastructure to create, but somebody else has. So we can very easily create this connection where you can get a view of risk that helps to give you a portfolio view. As more modelers come into market, as more views of risk are created, it's our job to try to bring them into the Model Exchange ecosystem. And importantly, this ecosystem is available to anybody. So any model from any vendor, we're happy to put on the exchange. Any platform, we're happy to connect to it because we believe that while we have a key role to play in bringing global resilience, we're not the only game in town, and we can provide access to other models to help make that easier. The harder question is, how do you create the public-private partnerships to be able to close the protection gap globally? So I mentioned it in our opening statement, but didn't quantify it. We would estimate that only about 40% of global economic catastrophe losses are insured. So that 60% from around the world comes from a lot of different places. Surprisingly to a lot of people, the United States has a huge protection gap. When you think about flood and earthquake, earthquake insurance is very expensive and flood insurance is very expensive. So how do you create a mechanism? And I don't have the answer. I can ask the question, but I don't have the answer. How can you create a mechanism where all these parties are having a conversation about risk, where everybody gives a little and everybody takes a little to come to some equilibrium that helps to solve this affordability and availability crisis? We are independent arbiters of risk and happy to be part of that conversation, but understand completely the complexity of how everyone is trying to solve that as best they can.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're really doing your best to create as much information as possible for people to use.
We're trying, yeah.
Okay, last question for you. What does success in all of this look like in 5 years, in 10 years?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball and could look forward. So we are in this game. Verisk is in this game. I personally am in this game because I truly want to be part of a solution that helps to make the world more resilient to catastrophes, better prepared, better responsive. So when you're looking at the tragedies that are happening on TV, there's going to be a solution in place to either mitigate the impacts up front or provide the protection people need on the back end. So in 5 years, if we have solutions in place that can either bring insurance coverage to markets that don't have it or close that protection gap domestically to provide more affordable insurance coverage to people who need it, or more mitigated properties in high hazard areas, that would be great. I mean, it's maybe, I don't want to say it's naive, it's hopeful. I think the more we all come together to identify what the challenges are, I think there's a chance that we can potentially make that happen.
Since we're not going to stop building beach houses and
No,
mountain
we will
views.
not. We will not. Sadly, no.
No.
That was Rob Newbold, President of Extreme Event Solutions for Verisk, joining us live at the Insurance Leadership Forum. Thank you to Verisk for sponsoring this podcast. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. For more podcasts, go to leadersedge.com.